Hey guys, tonight we dive deep into a story that's as dark as it is tragic. One that's filled with mystery, intrigue, and a dash of old-world glamour. Picture this, a beautiful young woman, a rising star in a decadent world of wealth and power, suddenly found dead under mysterious circumstances. This is the story of Rosemarie Nitribitt, a woman whose life and death captivated Germany and the world. But just as you settle in, keep in mind that this tale isn't a simple one. It's filled with secrets, lies, and questions that may never be answered. You probably won't survive this mystery unscathed, but you'll certainly be drawn into its web. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your neck of the woods. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Rosemarie Nitribitt's life was a dazzling contradiction, much like the world she inhabited. On the outside, she was the epitome of high-class allure, but her story began in the most unassuming way possible, a small town in post-Wadubabdupu, Germany. Born in 1933, Rosemarie came from a family that wasn't rich by any stretch of the imagination. Her early years were marked by hardship. Her father was absent, and her mother struggled to make ends meet. Still, Rosemarie's beauty was undeniable, and it didn't take long for her to realize the power she could wield with it. As a teenager, she found herself escaping the confines of her small town, drawn to the larger, more glittering world of Frankfurt. There, she quickly became entangled with a group of women who lived a very different kind of life, women who had access to luxuries Rosemarie had only dreamed about. It wasn't long before she took her place among them as a high-class escort living in the shadows of society's elite. This world was one of excess expensive cars, luxury hotels, designer clothes, and of course, the men who paid for her company. But behind the velvet curtains of the high society world lay a more sinister reality, one Rosemarie would soon have to face. She was surrounded by powerful men, politicians, businessmen, and even some with connections to organized crime. Despite the glitz and glamour, it was a world where women were often disposable, and Rosemarie, it seemed, was just another beautiful face in a sea of many. But the price of beauty in a world of privilege can be steep, and soon Rosemarie's life would be marked by tragedy. You've already gotten a glimpse into the world Rosemarie Nitribitt navigated, the glitzy, shadowy world where beauty and danger go hand in hand. But let's now rewind a little bit. You see, before the high-end apartments, the expensive suits, and the political figures, there was a different Rosemarie, a girl with humble beginnings, who had no idea that life would turn out to be anything but ordinary. Imagine a small town in Germany in the 1930s. The war had just ended, leaving behind broken families, economic instability, and an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. This is where Rosemarie was born on the 19th of May, 1933, into a working-class family. Her father wasn't around much, leaving her mother, a young woman herself, to raise Rosemarie along with her siblings. Despite these challenges, Rosemarie had something that set her apart: her beauty. Even as a child, she had that captivating, almost otherworldly look that seemed destined for bigger things. As she entered her teenage years, Germany was still reeling from the aftermath of the war. The country was trying to rebuild, but things were far from stable. Yet in this turbulent environment, Rosemarie's beauty began to open doors for her. A chance encounter with some of the city's wealthier women led to her entry into a new world, one where money and power were easily exchanged for company. She found herself in the company of women who had lives very different from her own, women who had learned the art of charm, the skill of seduction, and the importance of making the right connections. It was here that Rosemarie's life would take a drastic turn. She quickly adapted to this new lifestyle, one filled with luxury and privilege. But as she spent more time with the city's elite, she realized that this world wasn't all champagne and diamonds. There were rules unwritten, but very real rules that governed everything, including the way she was treated. The men she interacted with often saw her not as a person, but as an object, a possession, a fantasy, to be indulged and discarded when the time was right. But Rosemarie, for all her beauty, was also sharp. She knew how to manipulate the world around her, using her looks to secure power and wealth. Still, despite her success, a deeper sense of unease began to settle within her. She couldn't help but wonder if the price of this luxurious life might eventually prove too high. Yet, for all the glitz and glamour, there was a part of Rosemarie that remained untouched. The young girl from a humble family who never fully embraced the cruel, cutthroat world of high society. She was playing a dangerous game, and the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. Now that you have a clearer picture of Rosemarie Nitribitt's origins, her humble beginnings and her swift rise into the world of high-class escorts, let's take a closer look at the type of world she entered. A world where money flowed freely, but so did the dangerous undercurrents of power, deceit, and manipulation. It's easy to imagine the sparkle of fancy cocktails, the glimmer of diamonds, and the shine of luxury cars. But what lay beneath? Let's dig a little deeper. As Rosemarie embraced her role in the world of the elite, she wasn't just living a life of luxury. She was gaining access to some of the most powerful men in Germany. These were men whose names echoed in the halls of politics, business, and even the criminal underworld. She wasn't just another beautiful woman being admired from a distance. She was a woman with power, or at least the illusion of it. The men who surrounded her were often wealthy businessmen, politicians, and influential figures who could make or break careers with a single phone call. To some, Rosemarie was a trophy, a mark of their own wealth and success. To others, she was something much more, something deeper, something dangerous. But here's where it gets murky. The world Rosemarie inhabited was built on more than just beauty and charm. It was a world fueled by secrets, secrets whispered behind closed doors, hidden from the public eye. Some of these men weren't just powerful, they were tied to organized crime, shady dealings, and even illegal activities that could ruin lives if exposed. But for Rosemarie, these secrets weren't just part of the deal, they were a part of her survival. In the world of high-class escorts, the line between luxury and danger was razor thin, and to survive, she had to navigate it with care. As she built relationships with these powerful figures, she learned the game. She knew how to get what she wanted, how to manipulate situations to her advantage. In some ways, she was just like the men she mingled with, calculating, ruthless, and always looking for the next move. But there was one thing that separated her from them. She wasn't just playing the game for money or power. Rosemarie wanted more. She wanted freedom, autonomy, and a way out of the life she had found herself in. But freedom in a world like hers was something that came at a steep cost. But then, of course, there's the flip side of all this glamour and power, the loneliness. In a world where people were commodities, where everyone was either buying or selling something, relationships were often transactional. Trust was in short supply, and betrayal was lurking just around every corner. It's easy to imagine how someone as beautiful and captivating as Rosemarie could charm her way into the hearts of men. But could she ever really trust any of them? This is the world she had entered, and it was only a matter of time before the walls would start to close in around her. By now you're beginning to understand the kind of world Rosemarie Nitribitt inhabited, a world of power, beauty, and dangerous liaisons. But let's zoom in on the men who filled this world. These weren't just ordinary businessmen or wealthy individuals. They were men with influence, their connections running deep within the corridors of government, the criminal underworld, and society's elite. Rosemarie's life wasn't just shaped by her looks, but by the company she kept. And it's here that we uncover the mystery behind her final days. Among the men she associated with, There was a select group who were particularly significant. Some were politicians, their influence enough to sway public opinion or control the fate of entire cities. Others were business tycoons, men whose companies held sway over entire industries. But not all of these men were as clean as they appeared on the surface. Behind the polished suits and the fancy dinners, some had ties to organized crime, their fortunes built on dubious deals and illicit transactions. These men weren't just charming, they were dangerous. Yet Rosemarie, with her beauty and sharp wit, found a way to remain in their orbit. Perhaps the most notable of the men in her life was someone who had become a regular in her world, a wealthy industrialist, whose name would eventually become linked with her death. This man, whom she had known for several months, seemed to have an almost possessive hold over her. There were whispers about their relationship, some claiming it was purely transactional, others hinting at something more. But in a world like hers, even the deepest relationships had layers of complexity, layers that could never be fully trusted. Rosemarie's connection with this man, whose identity has remained a matter of speculation, was complicated. On one hand, he showered her with gifts, luxury cars, and expensive nights out. On the other, he was often seen as controlling and manipulative, using his wealth and influence to dictate the terms of their relationship. Some believed that his interest in her went beyond just a casual affair, and that he might have had more than business or personal pleasure in mind. Could he have been one of the men who might have pushed her too far? Could he have been a part of the darker side of Rosemarie's life that no one dared to explore? The mysterious men surrounding Rosemarie didn't just offer her a life of luxury. They offered her a sense of safety, a way to navigate the dangerous waters of her world. But it was a false sense of security. In the end, those same men who had once seemed like protectors could have been the ones to bring about her untimely end. Historians still debate the nature of her relationships with these men. Were they genuinely in love with her, or were they simply using her for their own desires and ambitions? As we move forward, we'll begin to peel back the layers of this complex web of relationships and explore how the actions of these men might have led to her tragic and mysterious death. Now that you've gotten a glimpse into the complex world of Rosemarie Nitribitt and the powerful men in her life, let's take a step closer to that fateful night, the night when everything would come crashing down. It was the end of an era for Rosemarie, one way or another. She had no idea, as she slipped into the high-end apartment that would be her final resting place, that this night would mark the end of her story. But who was with her that night? What happened in the hours leading up to her death? Rosemarie had arranged to meet a man that evening, a man who would later be considered a prime suspect in her death. His name, however, remains a point of contention. Some believe he was a wealthy businessman with ties to powerful circles, while others speculate he was simply one of the many men Rosemarie had met through her work. Whichever he was someone with enough sway to enter her life and ultimately her tragic fate. The question remained, what was their relationship really like? And how far would it go? The evening began in a glamorous, almost cliché manner. Rosemarie, as always, was dressed to impress her beauty, captivating in a way that made even the wealthiest men take a second glance. They dined at an upscale restaurant, the kind of place where the wine flowed freely and secrets were easily exchanged over the soft hum of classical music. Was it just another evening for Rosemarie, or was there something different about this night? After dinner, they headed back to his apartment. The building, located in one of Frankfurt's most prestigious areas, was a luxury space with marble floors and gold leaf detailing a world away from Rosemarie's modest upbringing. Inside the apartment exuded power, a place for meetings, high-stakes deals, and whispered conversations. But it wasn't just the elegance of the surroundings that would define this night. It was the undercurrent of tension, something unspoken yet very real. Was it the promise of money, the threat of something more sinister, or the heat of desire that kept them together in that apartment? Whatever it was, it's clear that something went terribly wrong. Historians still argue whether it was a crime of passion, a simple transaction that escalated, or something deeper, something darker, perhaps even a calculated murder. That night, Rosemarie was found dead in the apartment. Her life snuffed out in an instant. The police were called and the investigation began, but it didn't take long for suspicions to rise. The question wasn't just who had killed her, it was why. What was the motive behind such a brutal end for a woman who had seemed just hours earlier to be living a life of untold luxury? As investigators began piecing together the details of that night, they would uncover a series of contradictions. Her death was far from clear-cut, and the more they uncovered, the more questions seemed to arise. Was it a crime of passion, a betrayal, or was it something that had been meticulously planned all along? The truth, it seemed, was elusive, and no one could agree on exactly what had happened in that apartment. The darkness of that final night in Rosemarie's life still hangs heavy over her story. As we move forward, we'll continue to unravel the mystery, one clue at a time, to understand exactly what led to that fateful moment. The night Rosemarie Nitribitt's body was discovered marked the beginning of a whirlwind investigation. Her life, full of contradictions and complexity, had ended abruptly, and the questions surrounding her death only seemed to multiply. The apartment where she had been found lifeless became a crime scene, its sterile luxury now soaked in an ominous silence. The scene was shocking not just for its brutality, but for the secrecy it seemed to shield. Who would have wanted to kill a woman like Rosemarie, so entangled in a web of high society? When police arrived at the scene, the details were sparse but disturbing. Rosemarie's body was discovered in a state of disarray. Her death was ruled as a homicide, but there were no immediate signs of struggle. No blood, no obvious signs of violent assault, just a young woman's life snuffed out too soon, leaving behind an unsolvable riddle. It was clear that this wasn't a random crime, nor was it a simple robbery gone wrong. This was a case that hinted at something more, something much darker. The lack of obvious signs of violence led investigators to consider a number of possibilities. Could Rosemarie have been poisoned? It wasn't uncommon in the circles she moved in, where betrayal and treachery were often masked by the most charming smiles and silken words. But if it was poison, where was the trace? Or was it something else entirely? The crime scene wasn't just disturbing. It was telling in ways that only the keenest eyes could spot. Evidence was scant, but there were subtle clues scattered throughout the apartment. There were traces of expensive perfume in the air, remnants of a dinner that hadn't been fully consumed, and a glass of wine left on a nearby table. Had Rosemarie known something, or was she merely another pawn in a game she couldn't escape? The more the police dug into her life, the more they discovered about the dangerous men she had consorted with. Men who had no qualms about destroying lives if it served their purposes. But the investigation didn't just look at Rosemarie's final moments. It expanded outward, examining the relationships and dealings she had formed over the years. One of the most crucial factors in the case was her association with a number of wealthy and influential figures. Some of these men had powerful political ties, while others were deeply involved in criminal activities. It wasn't just the women who lived in the shadows of society. Some of the men who played a role in her life did too. Rosemarie's circle was filled with individuals whose motives could be as elusive as their connections. It wasn't long before police had their eyes on several suspects, but even as they closed in, the case seemed to grow colder. Each lead they followed seemed to twist and disappear into an abyss of corruption and influence. Could one of these men have been involved in her death, or was there another force at work? The truth, it seemed, was as tangled as the web Rosemarie had woven for herself. As investigators continued to explore the depths of her life, they encountered the first of many roadblocks. Many of Rosemarie's associates were less than forthcoming with information. Some, it seemed, were more invested in protecting their own secrets than in solving the mystery of her death. And this is where the case grew particularly complicated, because the more the police uncovered, the more they realized that the investigation wasn't just about finding Rosemarie's killer. It was about unearthing a conspiracy, one that stretched far beyond her death and into the heart of Germany's political and social elite. As the investigation continued to unfold, the public's obsession with Rosemarie Nitribitt's case grew exponentially. The tragic death of a young woman, especially one as beautiful and enigmatic as she was, had become front-page news, and the media was more than eager to stoke the flames of curiosity. Headlines screamed her name, and every detail, no matter how small or insignificant, was dissected and analyzed. This wasn't just a case of murder. It had become a spectacle, a mystery wrapped in scandal, and the public couldn't get enough. The frenzy was overwhelming. The press swarmed around every lead, chasing rumors, fabricating stories, and giving rise to a dozen conspiracy theories. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone seemed to be an expert on what had happened. Was Rosemarie's death tied to a lover's quarrel? Was it the work of a jealous rival? Or was it something more sinister? Perhaps a crime of power where the men involved in her life were more than just casual players. The sensationalism that surrounded Rosemarie's case didn't help the investigation. It hindered it. The flood of misinformation only muddied the waters, making it harder for investigators to separate fact from fiction. Witnesses who came forward often had their own agendas, and those who were willing to speak about Rosemarie's life sometimes painted a picture that was too perfect or too biased. People who were close to her, men who had known her, who had shared her bed, were suddenly reluctant to speak out, and their silence was deafening. It became clear that many had something to hide, and the deeper the police dug, the more they realized that the case was larger and more dangerous than they had anticipated. But among the sea of speculation, there were a few leads that stood out. The first breakthrough came when the police finally managed to trace Rosemarie's last known movements. She had been with several people the day of her death, and while the timeline wasn't completely clear, it was becoming apparent that she had been meeting with someone influential, a man whose name had been whispered in circles of high society. This was someone with significant power, someone whose involvement with Rosemarie was more than just casual. The question was, what had they discussed that evening? And why had Rosemarie been so desperate to meet him? The investigation took an even darker turn when it became evident that some of the men in Rosemarie's life had something to gain from her death. Power struggles, blackmail, and hidden deals seemed to be part of the puzzle, and as police delved deeper into the connections between her lovers, the motives for murder began to pile up. Was it a crime of passion, a business deal gone wrong, or was it all a matter of someone trying to silence her for good? Despite the growing evidence, the investigation remained far from straightforward. The more they uncovered, the more layers they seemed to peel back, only to find more questions. Who could have done it? Who stood to lose the most from Rosemarie's death? Was it the powerful businessman who had been seen with her, or was it someone who had more to lose than anyone realized? What was becoming increasingly clear was that this was not just a simple murder. It was a carefully orchestrated event with deep roots in the dark world of politics, money, and power. And no one, least of all Rosemarie, had fully understood just how dangerous the game she was playing truly was. The deeper the police investigated Rosemarie Nitribitt's death, the more entangled they became in a web of deceit and corruption. What had initially seemed like a straightforward case of murder was now revealing itself to be a complicated puzzle with layers of intrigue that went beyond anything anyone could have imagined. Among the most intriguing and perhaps the most telling aspect of the case was the involvement of key witnesses, people who had seen things, heard things, or perhaps knew more than they were willing to admit. As investigators sifted through the testimonies, a few names started to surface again and again, individuals whose connections to Rosemarie seemed more significant than initially thought. The problem, however, was that many of these witnesses seemed to hold back, unwilling or perhaps afraid to share the full truth. Some of the men Rosemarie had been involved with figures of wealth and power either denied knowing her well or gave vague, inconsistent statements about their interactions with her. But there were others, those who were closer to her in her final days, whose accounts seemed to hold more weight. One of the most puzzling testimonies came from a woman who claimed to have been in touch with Rosemarie just hours before her death. She described how the young woman had seemed unusually agitated, almost as if she knew something terrible was about to happen. Rosemarie, she claimed, had mentioned that she was meeting a man who could help her escape the life she had been living, a man who was not just a lover, but someone with the means to take her away from everything. But there were no details about who this man was, and the witness could never quite pinpoint why Rosemarie seemed so nervous, almost frightened. This revelation opened a new line of inquiry. Had Rosemarie been planning to leave the life of luxury and danger she had become entangled in? Was her death in some way tied to her desire for freedom? Could one of the men she had been involved with have seen her departure as a betrayal, or worse, as a threat to their power? But the more investigators pressed, the more it became clear that Rosemarie's world was a vast, intricate network of relationships, many of which were bound by a delicate thread of secrecy. While some of the men who had known her were reluctant to come forward, others were suspiciously eager to clear their names. It became a game of who could tell the most convincing story, who could manipulate the facts to protect themselves. Yet, despite all the speculation, it wasn't just the men who were becoming key suspects. There were women in her life as well, some of whom had been in direct competition with her for the affection of wealthy men, and others who saw Rosemarie as a threat to their own ambitions. The competition among these women was fierce, and while many of them had remained silent for fear of implicating themselves, it became increasingly clear that some of them might have had a personal stake in seeing her removed from the picture. As investigators connected the dots, it became apparent that Rosemarie's death wasn't a random act of violence. It was a calculated and deliberate act orchestrated by someone who had a great deal to lose. And perhaps in the end, that's what made it all the more chilling, the knowledge that her death was not just an isolated event, but a symptom of a far larger, far darker undercurrent of power, influence, and betrayal. In the coming weeks, the investigation would shift gears once again, as new evidence began to surface, casting an even darker shadow over the entire case. But for now, the detectives could only sit with the haunting question: who was the true mastermind behind Rosemarie Nitribitt's murder? The relentless pursuit of the truth continued, but as the investigation into Rosemarie Nitribitt's death delved deeper, it became evident that the case had taken on a life of its own. What started as a homicide investigation now seemed to have evolved into something far more complex, a high-stakes game won with players whose motivations were as shadowy as the circumstances surrounding the death itself. One of the most crucial turning points in the investigation came when police started connecting the dots between Rosemarie's social circle and the many figures who had been a part of her life in the final years. The web of influential men, business tycoons, and even politicians who had crossed her path suddenly appeared less like accidental acquaintances and more like participants in a larger conspiracy. The press, of course, had already begun to speculate that there was more to her death than met the eye, but now investigators were seeing the same patterns. Among the most significant figures under suspicion was the powerful businessman who had frequently been seen with Rosemarie just before her death. His presence, while seemingly benign at first, began to cast a darker shadow the more investigators learned about his background. He was a man with deep connections in both the political and criminal realms, connections that, if exposed, could ruin not just his personal reputation, but his entire empire. Was it possible that Rosemarie had become a liability to him? Had she discovered something that threatened to bring down his carefully constructed world of secrecy? The theory gained traction when more was uncovered about his relationship with her. It was clear that Rosemarie was more than just another glamorous companion to him. She had, it seemed, been on the verge of revealing something that could have jeopardized him and his business dealings. Some speculated that she might have had an intimate knowledge of certain illegal transactions, perhaps even blackmail material. Could this be the reason for her murder? As investigators delved into his background, they discovered a troubling connection, an affair he had been hiding from the public eye, one that tied him directly to a shady underworld figure. This wasn't just about a woman who had overstayed her welcome. It was about silence, about controlling a narrative, and about making sure that certain secrets remained buried at all costs. But the businessman wasn't the only suspect. There were others who had a motive to silence Rosemarie, including those who had once competed with her in the world of high-class escorts. These women, some of whom had been bitter rivals, could have seen her as a threat to their own success. Could one of them have been driven by jealousy? Or perhaps a desire for revenge, seeing Rosemarie as someone who had surpassed them and outshone them in the eyes of powerful men? Yet there was another piece of the puzzle that continued to nag at investigators. Rosemarie had seemed oddly calm in the days leading up to her death, a sense of tranquility that had been noticed by those close to her. Some claimed she had been planning to leave her life of excess and disappear. Could Rosemarie's death have been the result of a botched escape plan, an attempt to break free from the grasp of the men who controlled her? With each passing day, the investigation revealed a more tangled web of secrets and lies. The more the authorities tried to make sense of Rosemarie's final days, the more complex the case became. And just as the public was beginning to think the truth was within reach, new leads and fresh evidence continued to emerge, adding yet more layers to the mystery. But one thing became increasingly clear: Rosemarie's life and death were inextricably tied to a system of power manipulation and dangerous alliances. And as the investigation moved forward, the question remained, who was really behind it all? Was it the businessman with his secret life, or was there someone else pulling the strings from the shadows, someone whose hands were far less visible, yet just as bloodied? As the investigation into Rosemarie Nitribitt's death continued, the mystery surrounding her life and the true motives behind her tragic end became ever more complicated. What had initially seemed like a straightforward case of murder had transformed into a labyrinth of intrigue, lies, and dangerous people who played their parts behind closed doors. The deeper the investigators dug, the more they realized that Rosemarie's death was not just an isolated tragedy. It was a symptom of a much larger, darker system at play. The public's fascination with the case only grew as new details emerged. But amidst the whirlwind of media speculation, there was one particular theory that started to take hold: the idea that Rosemarie's death was not the result of a personal vendetta, but rather a carefully calculated act of power. Some investigators began to believe that someone had orchestrated her murder, not just to silence her, but to send a message, a warning to anyone who might consider crossing the delicate, dangerous lines that defined this world of wealth, politics, and crime. One of the most significant developments came when police began to focus on the possible involvement of high-ranking individuals with ties to the political and criminal spheres. These were not just men who could offer Rosemarie luxury and wealth, but men who had far more to lose from her knowledge and the potential for exposure. They were the kind of men who lived in a world where secrets were currency and silence was the price of survival. It was this shadowy world that Rosemarie had found herself tangled in, and it was this world that could have been the reason for her untimely death. The investigation turned to the businessman who had been a constant figure in her life. His connections ran deep, and his wealth and influence were not just the foundation of his success, they were the very tools that kept his secrets buried. But even as investigators focused their attention on him, they realized that they couldn't ignore the broader network of power players who had been in close proximity to Rosemarie. She had been more than just a lover or a companion to these men. She had been a pawn, a symbol of the excess and decadence of the era. And in a world where power could be so easily threatened, Rosemarie's death was seen by some as an inevitable consequence of the game they were all playing. Historians and criminologists who studied the case were divided on the possible motive. Some believed that Rosemarie's death was an act of passion, perhaps a crime fueled by jealousy, anger, or betrayal. Others theorized that it was a cold, calculated move to eliminate someone who had become too dangerous to keep alive. Some even suggested that her death was tied to a broader political scheme, one where she had inadvertently found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time. Could she have known too much about illegal activities involving the highest levels of power? Was she in the end just another casualty of a system that would stop at nothing to protect its own? As investigators continued to work, they found that the more they uncovered, the more questions arose. The complex web of relationships surrounding Rosemarie, combined with the shroud of secrecy that enveloped her life, made it nearly impossible to discern the true nature of her death. Was she the victim of a botched attempt to silence her? Was she killed by someone close to her, someone who had a stake in her knowledge? Or was her death just one more reminder of the lengths people would go to in order to preserve their secrets? Despite the countless theories, the investigation seemed to stall at every turn. Witnesses refused to speak out, and those who did seemed to either have hidden agendas or were too afraid to tell the truth. The deeper investigators dug into the complex relationships that defined Rosemarie's life, the more it became clear that this was not just a case of a woman caught in a dangerous lifestyle. This was a case about power, about who held it, who wanted it, and who would go to unimaginable lengths to maintain it. Rosemarie Nitribitt's death had become a symbol of something much larger than herself, a tragic reminder of the price of beauty ambition and the desire for control in a world built on secrets. As the investigation into Rosemarie Nitribitt's tragic death continued, it became increasingly clear that her murder wasn't simply an isolated event, but a part of a much larger and far-reaching web of corruption, secrecy, and political intrigue. The more the authorities dug, the more they realized that they were not just trying to solve the death of a woman, they were peeling back the layers of an entire system that had thrived on manipulation and control. At the heart of the investigation were the powerful men who had been involved in Rosemarie's life. The businessman who had once been a significant part of her world, whose shadow loomed over much of the case, seemed to be at the center of a tangled web of corruption that spanned not just the private sector, but also high political circles. His wealth and influence made him untouchable in the eyes of many, and the possibility that he might be connected to Rosemarie's death was something no one wanted to face. However, as investigators pushed forward, the evidence that tied him to the crime grew more substantial. But the businessman wasn't alone. As investigators sifted through the murky world that Rosemarie had inhabited, they found other figures with direct or indirect ties to her, some of whom were even more dangerous than they had initially realized. Some of these men had connections to criminal organizations, while others had built their empires on illegal dealings, using the guise of legitimate business practices to cover their tracks. It was clear that Rosemarie had been a pawn in a game that none of them were willing to lose, and her murder may have been an effort to ensure that certain secrets never saw the light of day. Yet even as the investigation focused on these powerful individuals, there was still the question of motive. What exactly did these men stand to gain by silencing Rosemarie? The more the authorities investigated, the more they realized that Rosemarie had known things that could bring down the very institutions that had given these men their power. She had learned about illicit activities, shady business deals, and possibly dark political alliances that no one was supposed to know about. Was her death an attempt to stop her from talking? Or was it a punishment for trying to escape the dangerous world she had been drawn into? The investigators began to piece together a chilling theory. Rosemarie's murder wasn't just about her, it was about protecting the status quo. In the world that she had become a part of, where wealth and power were the currency of survival, anyone who threatened to destabilize the delicate balance of control had to be eliminated. Rosemarie, with her beauty, intelligence, and connections, had become more than just a symbol of luxury. She had become a threat to everything that these powerful men had worked so hard to build. But there was another darker possibility. Could the men who had been close to Rosemarie, those who had shared intimate moments with her, have killed her to protect their own interests? Was it possible that one of her lovers, perhaps someone who felt betrayed or fearful of being exposed, had taken her life to silence her once and for all? As the investigation moved forward, the pressure mounted. Rosemarie's death was becoming a flashpoint in a battle for control over a larger network of power and corruption. And despite all the progress made, the more they uncovered, the more questions arose. Who was really behind this? Was it one person or a collective effort to protect the system they had created? What exactly did they want to keep hidden? Despite the looming questions, one thing was clear. Rosemarie had become a symbol of something much bigger than herself. Her life, and especially her death, had drawn attention to the cracks in the system. Cracks that threatened to expose the very foundation on which the world of wealth and power was built. But as the investigation inched closer to the truth, it became more apparent that exposing the full extent of these secrets would come at a terrible cost. As the investigation inched closer to the heart of the mystery, the complexity of Rosemarie Nitribitt's life and death began to unfold in ever more disturbing ways. The deeper the authorities dug, the more they uncovered not just about her death, but about the systems of power and control that had shaped her world. The connections between the men involved, their ties to politics, business, and criminal organizations, became undeniable. It was clear now that Rosemarie's death wasn't a random act of violence or a mere crime of passion. It was the result of a calculated, deliberate effort to protect secrets far more significant than anyone had initially imagined. While the investigation focused on the key suspects, Rosemarie's lovers, her powerful business connections, and even the shadowy figures from the criminal underworld, it was the political ramifications that began to emerge as the true complexity of the case unfolded. Investigators soon realized that Rosemarie had been a part of a much larger scheme, a game played by men at the highest levels of power. And in a world where the balance of power could shift with a single revelation, Rosemarie had become too dangerous to be left alive. Historians and criminologists alike began to debate the true nature of her relationships with these men. Some argued that she had been nothing more than a pawn caught in the crossfire between warring factions. Others suggested that Rosemarie had known exactly what she was doing, that she had understood the stakes of the game she was playing, and was in some ways complicit in the system that ultimately led to her death. But whatever her role, it was clear that she had been far more than just a beautiful woman in a world of power and luxury. Rosemarie Nitribitt had become an instrument of change, whether she realized it or not. But as the investigation turned inward, one of the most chilling discoveries was the realization that the people closest to her, the ones who were supposed to be her protectors, were just as deeply entangled in the web of corruption as anyone else. The same men who had used her for their own benefit were now the ones whose secrets were at risk. The betrayal was more than just emotional, it was systemic, a betrayal of trust, of loyalty, and of the very values that these powerful figures claimed to uphold. Among the most shocking revelations was the discovery that some of Rosemarie's closest confidants, people she had once trusted, had been involved in her death. One of her lovers, a prominent figure in the world of finance, was found to have more than just a financial stake in her demise. He had been hiding illegal dealings, and the risk of exposure from Rosemarie had become too great. Others who had been close to her both in business and in personal matters had a much greater stake in silencing her than anyone had realized. Could one of them have taken the ultimate step to ensure that she remained quiet? The more investigators connected the dots, the clearer it became that Rosemarie's death was the result of a collision of motives, personal, political, and financial. The people involved had been playing a high-stakes game for years, and Rosemarie had unwittingly become a threat to everything they had built. To eliminate her was to protect their empire, their carefully constructed world of wealth, power, and influence. But even as the investigation seemed to reach its conclusion, there was one final heartbreaking question. Did Rosemarie understand just how dangerous her world had become? Had she known that in the end the men she had trusted most would turn on her, or had she simply been trying to escape to break free from the very life that had led her to this tragic fate? The investigation offered no easy answers, only more questions, more complexity. As the case began to wrap up, it became clear that Rosemarie Nitribitt's death had left a scar on society, one that went far beyond the life of a single woman. Her story had exposed the ugly truth about the lengths to which people would go to preserve their secrets, their power, and their wealth. And while the case may have reached a conclusion, the ripples of her death would continue to be felt for years to come. As Rosemarie Nitribitt's death continued to haunt the streets of Frankfurt, the legacy of her life, and more tragically, her death, began to leave a permanent mark on the city and beyond. For those closest to the case, there were no simple answers, no neat conclusions. The question of who was truly behind her death was never fully answered. But the investigation itself revealed something even more insidious, a world built on power, wealth, and secrecy, where the lives of those at the bottom were easily expendable. The case continued to unravel, and new revelations came to light. It was revealed that some of the most prominent figures tied to Rosemarie's life were already under investigation for separate financial and criminal activities. Her death had exposed cracks in the very system that had allowed these men to thrive in the shadows. Some feared that the investigation was far too close to exposing their own illicit dealings, which only added fuel to the fire of suspicion. The stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined, and the ramifications of Rosemarie's death had become a larger political issue, one that stretched far beyond her life. The public's attention remained focused on the scandal, and the media, as always, was eager to provide new angles, new theories. Speculation ran rampant as journalists raced to offer their own versions of the truth. Some painted Rosemarie as a tragic figure, a young woman consumed by her own desires and unable to escape the dangerous world she had willingly entered. Others saw her as a victim, a symbol of the manipulation and exploitation that ran rampant among the powerful. But no matter how the media chose to portray her, one thing was certain: Rosemarie's story had left an indelible mark on the public consciousness. But amid the frenzy of public opinion, the authorities were beginning to question the true nature of the investigation. Some began to wonder whether the case had been deliberately mishandled to protect those at the top. Was there a cover-up? Had the powerful figures implicated in her death manipulated the course of the investigation? As the case reached its final stages, the police found themselves up against an impenetrable wall of silence, one built by those with enough wealth and influence to ensure that they would never face the consequences of their actions. Despite the growing sense of injustice, the case officially closed with no clear answer as to who was responsible for Rosemarie's death. No one was ever formally charged, and the true mastermind behind the murder remained hidden in the shadows. But the unanswered questions lingered in the air, like the smoke from a fire that refused to die. In the aftermath, many continued to believe that Rosemarie had been murdered, not just because of what she knew, but because of what she represented. She had been a symbol of the dark side of a society obsessed with power and luxury, a society that often treated those who lived on the fringes as disposable. Her death was the price of crossing the line of getting too close to the truth. In the end, Rosemarie was not just a casualty of her world, but a reminder of the dangers that lie in the shadows of wealth and influence. As the years passed, her story faded from the headlines, but her legacy endured in the hearts of those who remembered her. She had been more than just a figure of scandal. She had been a woman caught in the gears of a machine that was far too powerful to stop. And while her death may have been forgotten by many, it had not been forgotten by those who understood the true cost of living in a world where the powerful rarely face justice. The passage of time did little to diminish the haunting memory of Rosemarie Nitribitt's death. Her story, as tragic and mysterious as it was, became a touchstone for discussions about power corruption and the dangers that lurked within the high society she had inhabited. For those who remembered her, the unanswered questions surrounding her murder remained a symbol of the larger, darker truths that many preferred to ignore. The case might have been closed, but its implications continued to ripple through the years. Despite the official end of the investigation, rumors and conspiracy theories persisted. Some believed that the truth behind Rosemarie's death would one day come to light, that someone, perhaps a whistleblower, perhaps a disgruntled insider, would finally bring the powerful men involved to justice. Others, however, felt that the case was simply too entrenched in corruption for anyone to ever speak out. The more time passed, the more difficult it seemed for anyone to bring the full story into the open. Rosemarie's life, in a way, had become an enigma, as layered and elusive as the forces that controlled her world. As history unfolded, her story was often retold, but not always with the nuance it deserved. Some saw her as a tragic figure, a woman who had been caught up in a world of excess and ultimately paid the price for it. Others viewed her as a victim of circumstance, a pawn in a game far beyond her control. But there was another group of people who saw something deeper in Rosemarie, those who understood that she had been a part of something much larger, something that was inherently flawed. Her death was not just the end of a woman's life, but a revelation about the structure of the society she had lived in. In the years that followed, the memory of Rosemarie's death continued to haunt those who had been closest to her. For the men who had been involved in her life, it was impossible to escape the consequences of their actions, even if they were never held accountable. Their involvement in her death, whether direct or indirect, remained a stain on their reputations, a shadow they could never fully outrun. Rosemarie's legacy, though, was not just one of death and scandal. It was a story of survival of a woman who had fought to carve out her place in a world that seemed determined to use and discard her. In the end, she had been more than just a high-class escort or the victim of a brutal crime. She had been a reflection of the world she inhabited, a world where those at the top controlled everything and those at the bottom were left to fend for themselves. Historians still debate the true meaning of Rosemarie Nitribitt's story. Was she a victim of a corrupt system? A casualty of the high-stakes game played by the rich and powerful, or was she in some way complicit in the system she had come to dominate? The truth is perhaps less clear-cut than we would like to believe. What is undeniable, however, is the impact her death had on the public and on the individuals who were closest to her. It was a stark reminder of the dangers that lurk in the pursuit of power, wealth, and beauty, and the cost of living in a world where the rules are stacked in favor of the few. In the end, Rosemarie Nitribitt's death remains a mystery, a story of a life cut short of secrets that will never be fully uncovered, and of a society that continues to struggle with its own demons. But her legacy endures not just in the cold case of her death, but in the lessons her story teaches us about the world we live in, and the lengths people will go to in order to protect their own interests. As the years passed, the case of Rosemarie Nitribitt became one of those stories that lingered in the collective memory, faded but never forgotten. The intrigue, the mystery, and the tragic loss of a young woman whose life had promised so much all collided in a manner that seemed to reflect the darkest sides of human nature. Though the official investigation had ended, the ripples of her death continued to reverberate through the halls of power, influencing those who had been involved and shaping public discourse about the shadowy side of wealth, politics, and society's elites. In the wake of Rosemarie's death, Frankfurt society began to change, albeit subtly. Her case had become a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power, an emblem of how the rich and powerful could manipulate and dispose of those beneath them without consequence. It also sparked a conversation about the dark underbelly of high society that many were too comfortable ignoring. For some, Rosemarie's story became a rallying cry, a reminder that no matter how powerful or influential someone seemed, their secrets could be exposed, their lives could be upended, and justice could still be sought, even if it was delayed. But for those who were directly impacted by Rosemarie's death, the case was far from over. Those who had known her best were left to grapple with their own feelings of guilt, fear, and regret. The businessman who had been so entangled in her life and the other powerful figures whose secrets had been threatened by her continued to live under the shadow of her murder. Their lives, though they seemed untouched by the public's obsession with the case, were marked by a silent, constant unease. They had gotten away with it, or so they thought, but the stain of what they had done was not easily erased. For the public, Rosemarie's death remained a cautionary tale, a warning of the price that came with living on the fringes of a world dominated by those with power and influence. The case itself, though cold, had ignited a much-needed discussion about the systems that allowed such tragedies to occur in the first place. It wasn't just about Rosemarie, it was about the society she had been part of. A society that had allowed someone like her to be used, discarded, and ultimately killed in the name of maintaining power. Despite the years that had passed since her death, some still believed that the truth about what happened to Rosemarie would one day emerge. There were whispers, rumors, and occasional breakthroughs, but nothing ever solidified into a clear, undeniable account of what had transpired. In many ways, the mystery of her death had become as much a part of the legend of Rosemarie Nitribitt as her life had been. And that mystery in itself was powerful. It kept her memory alive in the minds of those who had followed her story, whether out of fascination or a desire for justice. In the end, however, it wasn't just the unresolved questions that kept Rosemarie's story alive. It was the lessons it taught, the stark reminder of how power could be used, abused, and protected even at the cost of a life. And so, as we reflect on Rosemarie's story, we are left with the lingering thought that the mysteries of her death may never be fully solved. But perhaps that is part of the tragedy itself, the fact that even in death, she could never fully escape the world that had used her, manipulated her, and ultimately destroyed her. Rosemarie Nitribitt may have left this world too soon, but in her wake, she left a question that still lingers: who was truly responsible for her death? And perhaps more hauntingly, how many others like her have been lost to the dark corners of society? Their stories never told, their fates never known. End of script. Sweet dreams.